Ultra-photorealistic 1954 radio studio scene. DJ Dewey Phillips at WHBQ microphone holding vinyl record, vintage broadcasting equipment. Young nervous Elvis Presley, age 19, standing in doorway of studio, Memphis radio station interior. All 14 phone lines lit up with calls visible on switchboard. Authentic 1950s broadcasting technology, documentary photography style, Kodak Tri-X black and white film grain, dramatic lighting from studio equipment, pivotal moment in music history, shallow depth of field focusing on Dewey and Elvis, cinematic composition, style raw, V7.0, R16.9, Q2. July 8, 1954. 47,000 people heard Elvis on radio. Nobody knew if he was black or white. Then Dewey asked the question. Memphis, Tennessee. WHBQ radio station. 9:30 p.m. on a Thursday night in July. That would change music history forever. Dewey Phillips, the most popular DJ in Memphis, maybe in the entire South, a white man who'd broken every unwritten rule about what music white DJs were supposed to play, was 4 hours deep into his Red Hot and Blue show when he queued up a record that Sam Phillips from Sun Records had dropped off that afternoon, with trembling hands and barely contained excitement. Just an acetate. A test pressing still warm from the lathe. Not even officially released yet. Not pressed on vinyl. Not distributed to stores. Just one copy of a song called That's All Right by someone named Elvis Presley that Dewey had never heard of, though the name struck him as unusual. Elvis like some kind of stage name. Something theatrical that didn't quite fit Memphis in 1954. Dewey dropped the needle onto the acetate with the careful touch of someone who'd handled thousands of records and knew exactly how fragile these test pressings were. Let the song play through his studio monitors first, checking the sound quality, making sure the recording levels wouldn't blow out the transmitter or sound distorted through the cheap radio speakers most of his audience owned. Listening critically, professionally, the way a DJ had to listen before putting anything on air. And within the first 10 seconds, within the first bright acoustic guitar riff and the first vocal line that came in loose and confident, and unlike anything Dewey had heard before, Dewey Phillips understood he was holding something dangerous. Something that didn't fit any existing category or format or expectation. Wasn't country, though it had country instrumentation. Wasn't rhythm and blues, though the vocal phrasing came straight from black gospel and blues traditions. Wasn't pop, though it had a catchiness and accessibility that pop required. Was some new hybrid thing that pulled from all three and fused them into something Memphis, something America, had never heard before. He played it on air. Didn't say much beforehand. Just here's something new from Sun Records. Then the song went out over WHBQ's signal, reaching into homes across Memphis and surrounding counties, reaching approximately 47,000 people who were tuned in on a Thursday night in July 1954. Look at what happened in the first 30 seconds after that song finished playing. After the last guitar note faded, and Dewey came back on the microphone. The phone lines at WHBQ lit up like a switchboard in an emergency. Not one or two calls from enthusiastic listeners. Not a handful of people curious about a new sound. All 14 lines. Every single one ringing simultaneously with such intensity that the bells seemed to merge into one continuous alarm. The switchboard operator, a woman we'll call M, representative of the dedicated staff who handled incoming calls and kept the station running, couldn't answer fast enough. Couldn't clear one call and move to the next before 3 more lines started ringing. Her hands moved frantically across the switchboard, plugging and unplugging connections, trying to keep up with demand that seemed to be growing exponentially with each passing second. The callers weren't just calling to say they liked the song. They were calling with urgent questions that tumbled out before men could even finish saying WHBQ, how can I help you? Who was that singer? What was that song called? When would it play again? Where could they buy it? Was it available in stores yet? Could she transfer them to someone who could tell them more? The desperation in their voices was palpable, like they'd heard something that had fundamentally shifted their understanding of what music could be, and they needed to understand it, to categorize it, to make sense of it before the feeling faded. Dewey had been a DJ for 5 years, had heard plenty of songs generate response. But this was different. This was people responding to something they'd never encountered, something that confused and excited them equally. The voice sounded black, had that rhythm and phrasing from black gospel and blues, but the song itself felt like country music. White music. So what was it? Wait. You need to understand what Memphis was in 1954, a southern city under strict segregation laws. White and black people lived in different neighborhoods, attended different schools, used different facilities. Music was segregated too. Country was white, R&B was black. Radio stations played one or the other, rarely both. But That's All Right didn't fit the established categories. The singer had the phrasing and emotional intensity of black R&B singers that white audiences had been taught to categorize as race music and keep separate. But the song was a country blues number, originally recorded by Arthur Crudup, rearranged in ways that sounded more country than blues. And the instrumentation, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, upright bass, was straight out of country tradition. So which was it? Was Elvis Presley black or white? The calls kept coming with urgency. Malik, the switchboard operator, was completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume. Started just taking names and numbers, promising callbacks that would never happen, because there wasn't time. Dewey, watching this chaos through the studio glass, made a decision. He'd play the song again. Let people hear it a second time. Make sure the response wasn't just novelty or confusion. He played it again. The phones exploded again. Same intensity, same questions, same confusion about who and what this was. So Dewey played it a third time. Fourth time. By 10:30 p.m., he'd played That's All Right 7 times, and the phone calls hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd intensified as more people tuned in, having heard from friends and neighbors that WHBQ was playing something extraordinary. Notice what Dewey understood that other DJs might have missed. This wasn't just a good song. This was a cultural moment. This was the sound of segregation breaking down in real time. White people hearing black music performed by what sounded like a black artist and loving it. Black people hearing country music arrangements and recognizing the emotional authenticity, and nobody knowing, not being certain, whether the performer was black or white. That uncertainty was revolutionary. In 1954 Memphis. Remember that Elvis Presley at this point was nobody. A 19-year-old truck driver for Crown Electric Company who'd recorded this song 2 days earlier, on July 6, 1954, at Sun Studio with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black. Sam Phillips, who owned Sun Records, had been trying for over a year to find a white singer who could sing with the emotional authenticity of black artists. Had auditioned dozens of singers. Had nearly given up. Then Elvis had walked into Sun Studio in late 1953 to record a song for his mother, and Sam had heard something. Not what he was looking for. Not yet, but something. Potential. Sam had called Elvis back for more sessions. Had paired him with Scotty and Bill. Had spent months trying to find the right material, the right arrangement, the right approach. Nothing had clicked until July 6th, when they were taking a break during a frustrating session, and Elvis started playing around with That's All Right, an old Arthur Crudup song, started singing it loose and casual, not trying to impress anyone, just goofing around. And Scotty and Bill had joined in, following Elvis's lead, and suddenly, there it was. The sound Sam had been searching for. White musicians playing black music with absolute authenticity. Or was it black music? Was it country? Was it something new? Sam had recorded it immediately. Got it down before the magic disappeared. Made an acetate the next day. Brought it to Dewey Phillips on July 8th. Because Dewey was the only DJ in Memphis who might understand what this was. Who might be willing to play something that didn't fit existing categories. Who had an audience, black and white listeners that might respond. And they were responding. By 11 p.m., Dewey had played That's All Right 14 times. 14 plays of the same song in less than 2 hours. Something that never happened on radio. Something that violated every convention about programming and variety and keeping audiences engaged. But the phones kept ringing. People kept calling, wanting to hear it again. Wanting to understand what they were hearing. Wanting to know who is Elvis Presley. Look at what was happening across town during this broadcast, while Dewey Phillips was playing That's All Right for the 3rd, 4th, 5th time. Elvis himself wasn't listening. Couldn't bear to. Couldn't stand the idea of hearing his own voice on the radio. Of hearing people's reactions. Of discovering in real time whether his musical dreams were about to come true or collapse into embarrassing failure. He'd gone to the Suzor No. 2 Theatre on South Main Street with his father Vernon, leaving Gladys at home because she was too nervous to sit still, too anxious to pretend to watch a movie when her son's entire future was being decided on the radio. The Suzor was a modest theatre that showed second-run films to working-class audiences who couldn't afford first-run prices at the fancier venues downtown. Elvis and Vernon sat in the dark watching whatever was playing. Neither of them would remember the title afterward, neither of them was actually watching the screen. Elvis's mind was elsewhere, racing through worst-case scenarios, imagining Dewey playing the record, and dead silence following. No phone calls, no response. Just the DJ awkwardly moving on to the next song like nothing had happened. He was physically hiding in that theater, using the darkness as cover, using the movie as excuse, too scared to be home where he'd have to confront the results, too terrified to be anywhere near a radio where he might accidentally hear his own voice, and know immediately, from his own reaction, whether he'd made something worthwhile, or something embarrassing. This was the defining moment of his life so far. 19 years old, everything riding on whether people in Memphis would respond to a song he'd recorded, almost as an accident during a break in a frustrating studio session, and he was hiding from it. But Gladys had stayed home, was listening to Dewey's show, heard the first play, heard the second. By the third play she understood something significant was happening. Ran to the theater, found Vernon, told him to get Elvis. They needed to go to the radio station. Now, Dewey wanted to interview Elvis on air. Vernon found Elvis in the dark theater, told him what was happening. Elvis's first response was panic, terror. He'd never done a live radio interview, wasn't trained, wasn't prepared. What would he say? What would Dewey ask? And there was another fear, deeper and more specific. What if Dewey asked him to talk about the music, about where it came from, about how a white kid from Mississippi had learned to sing like a black R&B artist? See, Elvis knew exactly what he'd done with That's All Right. Had absorbed black music, gospel, blues, R&B, from growing up in poor neighborhoods in Tupelo and Memphis, where black and white communities lived closer together than they did in middle-class areas. Had gone to revival meetings and heard black gospel singers. Had listened to WDIA, the black radio station in Memphis. Had absorbed Arthur Crudup and Big Boy Crudup and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and every black artist whose records he could find. That absorption wasn't appropriation in the cruel sense, wasn't theft or mockery, was genuine appreciation and integration. But in 1954, Mississippi and Tennessee, white kids weren't supposed to be influenced by black culture, weren't supposed to love black music, or want to perform it. That kind of boundary crossing was dangerous. Could get you ostracized, could get you hurt. So Elvis was terrified that Dewey would ask questions that would expose all of this, would make Elvis's racial influences explicit, would force him to either deny them, which would be dishonest, or acknowledge them, which could alienate white audiences who might be uncomfortable with a white singer who'd learned from black artists. Vernon and Gladys got Elvis into the car, drove him to WHBQ. By the time they arrived, Dewey had played That's All Right 2 more times. The phone lines were still lit up. The response wasn't fading. If anything, it was intensifying as word spread through Memphis. People calling their friends, friends tuning in, discovering this extraordinary song that nobody could categorize. Dewey saw Elvis walk into the station. Skinny 19-year-old kid with long hair and sideburns, dressed in the kind of flashy clothes that poor kids wore when they wanted to look sharp but couldn't afford conservative taste. Pink and black outfit that made him stand out, but probably for the wrong reasons. Elvis looked terrified, hands shaking, face pale, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Dewey, who'd been a DJ long enough to recognize stage fright, put a hand on Elvis's shoulder, said something like, "Relax, kid. Just answer my questions. You'll be fine." But Elvis wasn't fine, was convinced he'd mess this up, would say something stupid or embarrassing that would ruin everything. Wait, here's what makes the next part brilliant, and reveals Dewey Phillips as not just a DJ, but a cultural strategist who understood the racial dynamics of 1954, Memphis better than almost anyone. Dewey understood exactly what was at stake in this moment. Understood that 47,000 people were listening to their radios across Memphis and the surrounding region, and wondering the same question, is this kid black or white? Is this voice they're hearing? This voice that sounds so much like the black R&B singers they'd heard on WDIA, or seen performing in black clubs on Beale Street. Is this a black artist that Dewey is playing, or is this something else? Something new, something that doesn't fit the categories they've been taught to use. And Dewey also understood, with the clarity that comes from living in a segregated society and navigating its contradictions daily, that making race explicit asking Elvis directly on the air, "So Elvis, just to be clear for our listeners, are you white or black?" would be catastrophically dangerous. Would force white listeners to consciously confront the fact that they'd just spent the last hour falling in love with music that sounded black, that drew from black traditions, that crossed racial boundaries they'd been socialized to maintain. Would make the boundary crossing explicit and therefore threatening. Would give them permission, almost an obligation, to reject the music on racial grounds rather than accepting it on musical grounds. So Dewey had a strategy, a way to answer the question that everyone was asking without ever asking the question directly, a way to let white listeners know Elvis was white, to give them that reassurance, that permission to love the music without guilt or anxiety, without ever saying the actual words "Elvis is white" or "this is a white artist singing black-influenced music." The strategy was brilliantly subtle, brilliantly Memphis, brilliantly suited to a moment when culture was changing faster than social structures could acknowledge. Dewey brought Elvis into the studio, told him they were going to chat for a few minutes. Nothing formal, just conversation. The microphone was already on, already broadcasting. But Dewey didn't tell Elvis that, wanted him relaxed, wanted him natural. If Elvis knew he was on air, he'd freeze up, would be too nervous to sound human. They talked. Dewey, asking friendly questions about Elvis's background, where he was from, what school he'd attended, what he did for work. Elvis answering nervously but honestly, saying he was from Tupelo originally, had moved to Memphis when he was 13, had attended Humes High School, worked now as a truck driver for Crown Electric. Look at what Dewey just did. Humes High School. In 1954 Memphis, schools were segregated. Humes High was a white school. Black students attended separate schools. By getting Elvis to mention Humes High, Dewey had answered the race question without asking it. Anyone listening knew if Elvis attended Humes High, Elvis was white. The mystery was solved. White listeners could relax, could enjoy the music without worrying they were accidentally appreciating a black artist. Black listeners understood what they were hearing, a white kid who'd learned from black music and was performing it with respect and authenticity. The interview lasted maybe 5 minutes. Nothing spectacular, just a nervous kid answering questions about his life. But those 5 minutes accomplished everything. Established Elvis as white. Established him as working-class truck driver, not college student. Established him as local, Memphis kid, one of us. Made him real, turned him from a mysterious voice on a record into a person listeners could imagine and relate to. After the interview, Dewey played "That's All Right" 3 more times before his show ended at midnight. By the time he signed off, he'd played the song over 20 times in less than 3 hours, had created a sensation, had launched Elvis Presley's career, had done it with 14 phone lines and an audience of 47,000, and one brilliantly subtle question about which high school Elvis attended. Notice what this broadcast represents beyond just Elvis's career beginning. This was Memphis, and by extension, white Southern audiences, beginning to accept music that crossed racial lines. Not overtly, not consciously necessarily, but practically. They loved the song, loved Elvis's voice, loved what he was doing, and once they knew he was white, they could love it without confronting the racial complexity of what he'd learned and from whom he'd learned it. That complexity would haunt Elvis for years, would lead to accusations of appropriation, would make some black artists and critics angry that a white kid was getting famous for singing in styles that black artists had created but couldn't get played on white radio. Those accusations had validity. The music industry was racist, radio was segregated. White artists had opportunities that black artists didn't. Elvis benefited from that racist structure, even if he didn't create it. But in that moment, July 8, 1954, on WHBQ radio, none of that complexity was visible. All that existed was a song that made people feel something, a voice that moved them, a performance that transcended the categories meant to contain it, and a DJ smart enough to let the music speak for itself, while subtly managing the racial anxiety that might have undermined it. Remember that Elvis Presley left WHBQ that night, not understanding what had happened. Still nervous, still convinced he'd said something embarrassing on the air, though he couldn't quite remember what, because Dewey hadn't told him the microphone was on. Went home with his parents, tried to sleep but couldn't, kept replaying the evening in his mind. The next morning, July 9th, 1954, Elvis Presley woke up in his family's small apartment in Lauderdale Courts public housing and got ready for work at Crown Electric Company, like nothing fundamental had changed in the universe. Put on his work clothes, sturdy pants, and a shirt that could handle warehouse dirt and the physical labor of loading and unloading trucks. Ate breakfast with Vernon and Gladys, neither of them quite knowing what to say about the previous night, about the phone call from Dewey Phillips, about the interview Elvis had given without realizing he was on the air, about what it all might mean for their lives going forward. Drove his truck on his regular route, made deliveries to various businesses and construction sites around Memphis, carried supplies, filled out paperwork, did all the mundane tasks that defined his life as a working-class kid, trying to make a living in a city that offered limited opportunities to people without college degrees or family connections. Came back to the Crown Electric warehouse for lunch around noon, which is when everything shifted. The other workers, guys Elvis had been working alongside for months, guys who knew him as just another truck driver who showed up on time and did his job and didn't complain much, were gathered in the break room talking animatedly about something they'd heard on the radio the night before. This incredible new song. This singer who sounded like nothing they'd ever heard. Some kid named Elvis Presley. Had anyone ever heard of him? Did anyone know where he was from? Was he local or from somewhere else? How could they find out more? Elvis stood in the doorway of the break room listening to his co-workers discuss him like he was a mystery, a phenomenon, something that existed entirely separate from the 19-year-old truck driver standing right there in front of them with a lunch pail in his hand. And he realized in that moment that his life had split into two versions. There was Elvis the truck driver, the person these guys knew and worked with every day. And there was Elvis Presley, the singer, the voice on the radio that 47,000 people had heard and responded to and wanted more of. And those two versions were about to collide in ways he couldn't predict or control. Within a week, That's All Right was the biggest local hit Memphis had ever seen. Within a month, Elvis had quit his job at Crown Electric, was performing shows around Memphis and the surrounding region. Within a year, he'd have a contract with RCA. Within 2 years, he'd be the biggest star in America. But it started with Dewey Phillips, with 14 phone lines and 47,000 listeners, and one subtle question about which high school Elvis attended. With a DJ who understood that in 1954, Memphis, you couldn't just play revolutionary music. You had to manage the revolution. Had to let white listeners love black-influenced music without forcing them to confront their own racial contradictions. Had to make the boundary crossing feel safe, even though it was fundamentally dangerous to the segregated status quo. That's what Dewey did on July 8, 1954, created a space where music could transcend race without explicitly acknowledging race, where a white kid could sing like black artists and white audiences could love it without feeling they were betraying racial boundaries, where revolution could happen quietly, through entertainment, without anyone having to admit that revolution was occurring. Look at the long-term impact. Elvis's success opened doors for other artists who didn't fit racial categories, made it possible for rock and roll, fundamentally a fusion of black and white musical traditions, to exist as a commercial genre, changed what white audiences would accept, changed what radio would play. Didn't solve segregation, didn't end racism, but created cracks in the wall, created spaces where black and white culture could mix in ways that had been impossible before. And it started with one broadcast, one DJ, one song, and 47,000 people listening in the dark, hearing something new, responding to something they couldn't quite name but couldn't resist. That's how culture changes, not through grand declarations, but through moments like this, through a nervous 19-year-old answering questions about where he went to high school, while 47,000 people listened and understood the answer meant more than just education, meant identity, meant permission to love music that crossed lines they'd been taught never to cross. That's the lesson. Not that Elvis invented rock and roll. He didn't. Not that one broadcast changed everything. It didn't. Not by itself. But that cultural change happens through small moments of boundary crossing made palatable enough that people can accept them without recognizing how revolutionary they are. Dewey Phillips managed that moment with skill and subtlety, gave Elvis a platform, gave Memphis a new sound, gave America eventually a new music, all with one question: what high school did you attend? And 47,000 people heard the answer and understood what it meant and decided they didn't care. The music was too good, Elvis was too compelling, the future was too exciting to resist. just because it didn't fit the categories of the past. That's July 8, 1954. That's Dewey Phillips and Elvis Presley, and the birth of something new,